The subject of today's hearing is one of critical importance for our country. Infrastructure is, after all, the backbone of our economy. And as has been demonstrated in some of the hearings we've already had before this committee, for too long we've allowed our nation's infrastructure to fall apart by not providing the investments needed to maintain and modernize our highways, roads, and bridges, ports, airports, rail, transit system, and water infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers most recently gave the United States a D+, and I think they were grading on a generous curve on its 2017 infrastructure report card, stating recent efforts to invest in our infrastructure come nowhere near meeting the $2 trillion of immediate needs. What once was the finest infrastructure in the world has become a source of international embarrassment. The federal partnership on infrastructure has declined steadily since the 1900s. That federal partnership was evident from the beginning of the Republic with Ben Franklin's postal roads, the Transcontinental Railroad, the interstate freeway system. Today, much of our nation's infrastructure is nearing the end of its useful life. Aging lock and dams on our inland waterways, for those of you in the Mississippi River system, deteriorating roads, outdated airports hamper our quality of life and result in costly delays for U.S. commerce, and I will say for American citizens. Our nation's ports, through which 99% of international trade passes, need better landside connections to road, rail, and inland waterways, and deeper navigation channels to remain globally competitive. America's crumbling infrastructure also increases congestion, pollution, and commute times while compromising safety. We're falling apart as we are falling behind. Failure to close America's infrastructure gap has serious economic consequences, which we'll hear maybe a little bit about from our distinguished panel today, including millions of foregone American jobs, slowing American gross domestic product, and trillions of dollars of lost business sales. Hardworking American families already bear the brunt of inaction, losing more than an estimated $3,000 in disposable income each year we fail to act. As our infrastructure languishes, we fall behind our global competitors, and each member of the committee has seen that around the world. Countries and economies like Singapore, the Netherlands, Hong Kong far outpace the United States in terms of quality and the extent of their transportation and utility infrastructure. Economic competitors like China have prioritized high-speed rail infrastructure, development of advanced technology vehicles, and high-tech shipping vehicles to transform China into a leading manufacturing power, perhaps the leading manufacturing power by the year 2049. America also falls behind many other developed countries when it comes to resilience and sustainability of our infrastructure. Extreme weather from climate change, natural disasters, and other crises at seaports can result in billions of dollars of damage and loss of long-term activity, which makes our efforts to improve resilience of our ports and other infrastructure all the more critical. Sustainability must be part of any future infrastructure investment plans as well, so we can safeguard the environment and our planet. Meeting the needs of a 21st century economy will require robust federal funding, leadership, and a bold vision for how we address our infrastructure needs. It's time to initiate a trade agenda that puts American people first by creating the kind of good middle-class jobs working families need through infrastructure investment. The Moving Forward framework released by the House Democrats last week offers an important first step in achieving these goals by seeking to invest $760 billion in infrastructure over the next 5 years. The Ways and Means Committee also had a hearing last week to discuss how we can fund and finance these investments so we can start rebuilding and renewing America. These investments will spur innovation, increase economic activity, create family wage jobs, and restore the greatness of American infrastructure while boosting our global competitiveness. I hope that we can work with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle on what should be a bipartisan priority for us all. I'm convinced it is a bipartisan priority. It's past time to get the job done and responsibly fund and finance infrastructure investments. And make no mistake, how we actually fund it has been a sticking point. I understand that. It's one of the reasons I thought it important to have this hearing dealing with trade-related infrastructure. We have a couple of items within the purview of some of our witnesses that we might talk about that is a way to get at some of the long-term funding. One, legislation I have to allow local port authorities to increase passenger facility charges to meet these needs. We might hear from our colleagues. That's not in our jurisdiction. It's in transportation infrastructure, but it is a priority of Chairman DeFazio, and as I say, I have legislation that would do that. I've also been working with Congressman Lowenthal, H.R. 2723, which deals with national, multimodal, and sustainable freight infrastructure. And part of that legislation has a freight transportation infrastructure trust fund that would be funded by a national 1% waybill fee on transportation costs of goods. Now, these are two mechanisms that allow us to move forward, unlocking hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, and will allow the Highway Trust Fund to wait for a moment or two to ripen. I hope that we can move forward with opportunities to be able to not just table the problems, but work together on the solutions. And with that, I am honored to recognize my friend and colleague, the ranking member of the Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Buchanan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important hearing on trade, infrastructure, and global competitiveness. There is a bipartisan consensus as a need for a strong and effective infrastructure to maintain our competitive edge in the world. I hope we can work together to find an effective solutions to compete and win in the global economy. And also want to thank the witnesses for being here today, taking their time to testify and share their views. I also want to take this opportunity to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your commitment to getting to yes on USMCA. I was proud to work with you and the President to build a strong bipartisan support for this important agreement, which gives our negotiators credibility in other negotiations. Of course, to ensure America sees the benefits they are expecting from this and other recent trade agreements, we need the right to, in terms of infrastructure, to move goods, services, and people efficiently. I was glad to see the focus on competitiveness in today's hearing. America's economic competitiveness is vital to preserving our influence abroad. We must pursue policies that allow American manufacturers, workers, and farmers to thrive on the global stage. Improving our infrastructure is one aspect of this challenge, but we also must prioritize growth and a strong economy. That's why Republicans, under the leadership of the President Trump, have enacted pro-growth policies to create a booming economy that is working for all Americans. Republican tax cuts, regulatory reforms, and trade deals have boosted our standing worldwide and strengthened our economy and competitiveness. Investment in infrastructure, when done right, can also help facilitate trade and grow our economy. However, infrastructure projects in the U.S. are among the most expensive in the world because of regulatory burdens. As someone who's come from the business background, it's clear to me that we need to streamline how we build and maintain our infrastructure. And we need to be smart about how we use technology and maximize public-private partnership. These steps will allow us to leverage every dollar on infrastructure as effectively as possible, allowing for more growth and competitiveness. When it comes to trade, as a representative from a trade-dependent state, like Florida, we have 14, 15 ports. 1 in 5 jobs are trade-related. I understand the importance of strong infrastructure in facilitating international commerce. In my district, Port Manatee is one port. We had about $2.3 billion in regional economic impact and support 24,000 jobs in one of the smaller ports in the state. To conclude, Republicans agree that a strong and effective infrastructure is essential to facilitating trade and our competitiveness. I hope we can work together to improve our infrastructure in a cost-effective and efficient way. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and I thank you and the witnesses for taking your time out today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan, and I look forward to continuing our conversations and our partnership. We have today a distinguished panel of witnesses to discuss trade infrastructure. I should say any member who wishes to add an opening statement to the record is invited to do so. First, I would like to welcome Roxanne Brown, the International Vice President at Large of the United Steelworkers. Following Ms. Brown is Greg Riggin, Secretary-Treasurer of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. Then we will hear from Greg Richardson, the Deputy General Manager and Chief Financial Officer of the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Then you have the privilege of hearing from my constituent, Curtis Rabenholt, the Executive Director of the Port of Portland. Then we'll hear from Chris Spear, who's spent so much time before our committee, we're thinking about giving him a spot on the dais. The President and CEO of the American Trucking Association, who's been such an effective partner with us. Chris, welcome again. Finally, we will hear from Rick Campbell, Chairman of the Port Commission of the Port of Houston Authority. We thank you all for joining us. We would invite you to summarize your testimony, up to 5 minutes. To help you with the timing, there's a little light there that'll keep track. And we remind you to turn on your microphone. It's easier for us to hear you. You'll see the green light will turn to yellow when we're approaching the end of your time, and would hope that when you see the red light that you'll be able to conclude, and so we can get to being able to question you. Ms. Brown, you're welcome to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Buchanan, members of the subcommittee. My name is Roxanne Brown, and I'm honored to serve as International Vice President at Large for the United Steelworkers. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Our union has prepared a detailed submission, so I'd like to highlight how U.S.-made trade infrastructure is critical to domestic manufacturing workers, their industries, and their communities. As the largest manufacturing union in North America, representing the men and women who make the steel, paper, aluminum, chemicals, and other products that go out into the global marketplace, we understand the need for secure ports, roads, bridges, and rail systems. Roughly 28% of the pulp and paper products our 8,000 members make at International Paper is exported each year. Our members also know the vital role they play in providing the materials to build and upgrade our infrastructure systems. Infrastructure spending creates and maintains jobs not just in the construction sector. When mills and smelters are producing the components to upgrade our infrastructure, it's felt by the workers in terms of their jobs. It's felt by their communities whose schools, libraries, and hospitals benefit from the tax base their jobs provide. And it's felt by American industry. Our members in our union believe a few things. First, Congress must support and expand Buy America standards. All infrastructure projects built with public resources should be subject to existing federal procurement Buy America standards. These standards have long been established, are consistent with our international obligations, and provide critical business to American manufacturers. Our union supports the full application of existing preferences and the expansion of them to all current and future infrastructure spending. Second, investing in infrastructure creates jobs and boosts climate resilience. A $1 billion investment in infrastructure creates 21,000 jobs. Investing $2.2 trillion in America's infrastructure has the potential to add $1.66 trillion to GDP over 10 years, reduce greenhouse gas pollution, and boost climate resilience. Third, America's trade infrastructure needs to measure up to the productivity of America's manufacturing workers, who are the most productive in the world. But enabling that productivity to compete globally requires fair trade rules that raise global standards and the infrastructure necessary to facilitate export trade. Fourth, many USW member jobs are crucial to these updates. Their products are intertwined with the modes of export and related infrastructure to move goods. From our members at Goodyear and Danville, Virginia, who build aviation tires, to steelworkers supplying the 220 million pounds of American steel for the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York, we are key partners in building our export infrastructure. Fifth, components for our trade infrastructure should not be outsourced. Congress should be outraged and concerned that the ports across the country are sourcing next-generation superposed Panamax cranes shipped from China that are being stalled in Philadelphia, Tacoma, Port Everglades, New Orleans, and other locations across the country. Many of these cranes are built by the same state-owned firm that infamously provided substandard materials for the California Bay Bridge. Sixth, dire upgrades are needed. Liberty Steel invested tens of millions to improve its Georgetown, South Carolina facility producing steel wire. But the port for the steel mill cannot meet the company's needs since the last time the harbor was dredged was 2008. Finally, we can't forget human infrastructure. We have to invest in our federal workforce and related human infrastructure. Just 2 years ago, Customs and Border Protection was still using a 1994 MS-DOS operating system to run X-ray machines that inspect trucks at the South Texas land port. Steelworker members manufacture goods that touch every continent across the world. Every delay from inadequate infrastructure undermines our productivity and allows our global competitors to reap the benefit. Right now, America's infrastructure ranks 19th compared to our trading partners. We strongly encourage Congress to act to upgrade these critical systems. We thank the subcommittee for this hearing, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reagan?
Thank you. On behalf of the Transportation Trades Department, our 33 unions, and millions of frontline transportation workers, I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for the opportunity to testify today. Here in Washington, we often frame discussions about trade in the context of creating or modifying international trade agreements. Those discussions have traditionally put working Americans in a defensive position. For a good reason. Too often, workers are on the losing ends of those deals. That is why we fight to ensure good manufacturing and service jobs, the kind that prop up communities and promise a chance at a middle-class life, are not sent overseas. We fight to ensure that those jobs are not undercut by unfair or unenforced labor practices in countries like China or Mexico. We work tirelessly to claw back against false promises that opportunity will trickle down to working families while wealthy CEOs sit in corporate boardrooms counting their profits. But if we are serious about increasing U.S. trade, about bolstering our economy, and prioritizing America's workers, we need to be just as serious about investing in ourselves as we are about setting up international trade agreements. Investing in America's infrastructure is a real down payment in American competitiveness and American workers, a down payment that we know will deliver results to our members and to your constituents back home. This subcommittee in particular should know that we do not raise money to build highways, to maintain ports, ensure the safety of our international aviation system, or to build rail and transit systems simply for the sake of spending money. Instead, you know that if we want to have a 21st century economy, if we want to be world leaders in trade and competitiveness, we cannot risk falling behind by failing to make serious investments here at home. Investments, by the way, that much of the world is now outpacing us in making. When we fail to fund our transportation infrastructure, the effects are felt across our entire economy. Consider a few examples. At the Port of Virginia, surges in containers from large ships regularly put the port over capacity. These truck drivers are forced to wait out traffic jams 13 lanes wide that can take 8 hours to clear. This kind of paralyzing congestion delays the shipments of goods and raw materials, and it causes port drivers to lose out on pay. Chicago handles 1/4 of our nation's freight rail traffic, but outdated grade crossing once led to delays that caused trains to spend 30 hours traversing the region. Without the strong partnership of the federal government through the CREATE project, this bottleneck would have only grown worse and would have put a serious strain on our nation's economy. I would be remiss if I did not also point out that the trade relies on harnessing the ingenuity and unmatched ethic of the American worker. However, years of underinvestment have placed a strain on working people like never before. Transit takes a serious toll, hours-long commutes and unreliable or poor access to transit takes a serious toll on our economy and on your constituents who power it every day. From TTD's perspective, the policy solutions are no great mystery. We have long supported a modest increase in the federal gas tax because it remains the most efficient, reliable way to increase revenue for our service transportation network. We would also support efforts by lawmakers to transition to a mileage-based user fee. Congress also cannot ignore the importance of waterborne commerce. Due to years of budget gimmicks, revenues in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund remain unspent or have been used for purposes unrelated to port infrastructure. Legislation passed by the House earlier this year would finally allow $9 billion to be spent on projects to improve our ports and increase their competitiveness. Importantly, we know that jobs created by investments in transportation infrastructure are good jobs that people can raise families on. This is because of both high union density in the transportation sector and because of federal labor policies that have been paired with these investments. These strong standards should be expanded and applied to all future investments funded by this committee. I must also point out that it would be fruitless to invest in our domestic transportation infrastructure if the very industries that the infrastructure supports are hollowed out due to unfair competition. As this committee and Congress overall considers the wider scope of trade policy, enforcement laws must be essential to that conversation. And finally, Buy America rules should be aggressively applied to federal infrastructure programs so that we can grow our manufacturing base as we seek to reverse decades of underinvestment. It would be a grave mistake for the health of our nation to attack these important laws or to undercut collective bargaining rights that are essential to good jobs that can and should be created in this space. America's infrastructure used to be the envy of the world. Our parents and grandparents put their money and hard work on the line so that future generations could enjoy the economic opportunity they came together to create. It is now your turn to show America's working families that you are ready to meet the challenge that lies before you, to show our children the kind of courage and leadership that our parents dared to show us. We must not find ourselves back at this table in 10 or 30 years asking what went wrong. Why didn't we seize the opportunity to harness the simple policy solutions before us to promote American jobs and to ensure America's long-term economic well-being? With that, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Richardson, welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, members of the subcommittee and other members of the Ways and Means Committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today on trade infrastructure for global competitiveness. My name is Greg Richardson, and I am the Chief Financial Officer at Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport. And I am honored to appear before the subcommittee to provide an airport's perspective on global competitiveness. Hartsfield-Jackson is an economic engine, directly or indirectly generating approximately $82.4 billion and over 448,000 jobs for its region. Although the figures will vary throughout the industry, airports across the country have this same fundamental impact on their respective regions. For Atlanta, the connectivity to the world via the airport has certainly driven this economic impact, and that connectivity has encouraged several Fortune 500 companies to choose Atlanta as their corporate and North American headquarters. Hartsfield-Jackson is the busiest passenger airport in the world, handling over 110 million passengers in 2019, and continued growth is expected. Air travel throughout the United States is expected to grow considerably, intensifying the strain on the infrastructure of our nation's aging airports. Tourism is travel dependent, travel is experience dependent, and experience is infrastructure dependent. Thus, to impact tourism, we must positively impact our infrastructure. Replacement, expansion, and modernization of current facilities, gate additions to accommodate growing traffic and competition, enhanced roadways, and curbside access to reduce congestion are just a few of the major improvements needed in airports to enhance our global competitive edge. Additionally, the high adoption of technology in everyday life exerts pressure on airports to continue that experience throughout the passenger journey, such as self-service equipment at critical passenger touchpoints. And now biometrics promises to further the self-service potential. In Atlanta, Delta Airlines has introduced a small-scale, fully biometric ecosystem where a passenger can check in, clear the TSA checkpoint, and board the aircraft without producing an ID or travel document. In order to enable this technology on a large scale, airports must make significant investments not only in the hardware and software itself, but also in both data and physical infrastructure. Creating a better, safer, and more modern experience on par with other international airports is key to driving perception in international tourism. Comparable to the significance of international tourism is that of international trade via cargo. Cargo, just like passengers, has a journey or experience requiring immediate attention. Technological advancements to improve ground handling and plane-to-truck distribution will enhance efficiencies. A more large-scale infrastructure need is intermodal connectivity, which is a well-established method of moving freight from international gateways to smaller communities that depend on trade to drive economic activity in a series of downline communities. This connectivity is essential to efficient and timely trade. Airports and railroad infrastructure were largely developed independently, and in the United States, the focus in the past 20 years has been on passenger connectivity to airports via rail. This leaves cargo freight movements highly dependent on over-the-road delivery for regional penetration. On its face, this is not a challenge, but the aging highway infrastructure and the increasing level of congestion around rapidly growing urban areas like Atlanta means freight shipments may experience costly delivery delays. Intermodal transportation is a hub concept, combining air, rail, and road, is a proven method of stimulating international trade. Lastly, as e-commerce evolves, the mix and distribution of cargo will shift, and automation and facilities need to be flexible to manage that demand. So how do we fund the necessary infrastructure improvements for airports? Airports in the United States are self-sustaining enterprises within a local or state governmental structure. Although net revenue is used to support our capital program, it is insufficient to fund the entirety of the program. Therefore, the primary sources of funding for capital development are passenger facility charges, airport improvement program grants, and general airport revenue bonds. In the context of this conversation, I respectfully request that this body support efforts to increase the current $4.50 cap for PFCs, which has been unchanged for 20 years. PFCs are a user fee, directly benefiting the passengers and their experience. PFCs are local funds used for FAA-approved projects at airports to enhance safety, security, and facilitation of passengers and goods. Increasing the PFC cap will enhance the global competitiveness we are discussing today without impacting the federal budget. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and the members of the subcommittee for calling attention to this issue. In order to remain competitive for tourism and trade, we are ready to engage in proactive collaboration with our governmental partners to focus on infrastructure improvements to benefit the nation, regions such as Metro Atlanta, and the businesses and employees who rely on our ability to remain globally competitive. I welcome any questions you may have and look forward to working collaboratively with you on this issue of national importance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Mr. Robenhoff?
Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Curtis Robinhold, Executive Director of the Port of Portland. The Port of Portland was actually created in 1891 to dredge the length of the Columbia River from Portland out to the Pacific Ocean, but today we're much more. We are 3 airports, including fan favorite PDX, but we're also 4 marine terminals on the Columbia and Willamette River, and we're the largest owner and developer of industrial property in the state of Oregon. Today, we connect people and cargo to national and global markets at those 3 airports. Our Columbia River is the largest wheat export gateway in the United States. We also deliver fresh Oregon blueberries and cherries on overnight cargo flights to Asia, and we ship Nike air soles, high-tech Intel chips, and small company products like Hydro Flask water bottles to markets abroad. To do all this, the port relies on investments in nearly every kind of infrastructure imaginable: waterways, marine terminals, airports, roads, and railway connections. I'd like to share a recent example. At the start of this year, the port welcomed the return of regular container shipping to our terminal on the Columbia River after several years without a trans-Pacific cargo service. Just last week, I watched the largest container ship to ever come up the Columbia River berth at our Terminal 6 and load and unload cargo bound for Asia. That would not have been possible without the annual dredging to maintain the Columbia River to a depth of 43 feet. However, we can only move this cargo efficiently if the Army Corps of Engineers is provided enough funding to maintain the federal navigation channel. Fully spending harbor maintenance tax collections each year is a key priority for us, and we appreciate that the House has passed a bill this year to do just that. We also know that trade-related infrastructure investments only matter if they can withstand the impacts from a changing climate. An increasing threat of natural disasters endangers our public safety, our economy, and our environment, and taps federal dollars for recovery and relief. We must prioritize a comprehensive approach to investments that keep us competitive, safe, and resilient in the face of climate change, which is exactly what the Moving Forward framework proposed last week aims to do. This commitment means a lot to us. Getting even more specific to the region I call home, Oregon faces the very real possibility of a massive earthquake caused by the Cascadia subduction zone off of our coast. Following a 9.0 earthquake, the ground beneath PDX would settle, cracking the runway and making it impossible for planes to land safely. But investment in advance would mitigate some of this expected impact. We have evidence from Japan to support this. The 9.0 earthquake that struck Japan in 2011 caused a massive earthquake and tsunami, and 15,000 people were killed. The devastation was staggering, but the country's investments in seismic infrastructure made rapid recovery efforts feasible. A portion of the runway at Sendai Airport had been retrofitted to withstand a large earthquake. Because of this, just 5 days after the quake, despite significant damage to the airport terminal, the U.S. Air Force landed a Lockheed C-130, delivering much-needed food, water, and medical supplies to the region. I visited Sendai Airport in 2017 and spoke with the airport's director, who stressed how important the airport was to the region's recovery. PDX will play a similar role when a Cascadia subduction zone quake hits the Pacific Northwest. Mitigating seismic risks is critical, but it is a significant investment. The port estimates the cost of a resilient runway to be well over $100 million. An increase in the passenger facility charge, a long-standing priority for every U.S. airport, is included in the Moving Forward package and would absolutely help. But we'll need a variety of funding sources to make this critical infrastructure project a reality. On this topic, I want to share my appreciation with our congressional leaders, Representative Blumenauer and Senator Wyden, for their work on the Move America Act, bipartisan legislation that should provide flexible infrastructure financing tools that are crucial to the port and other public-private entities like us. Finally, as someone from a region so closely connected to trade, I would be remiss if I didn't add that while smart investments like those I highlighted are the best ways to facilitate trade, consistent trade policies are what keep our economy stable. I applaud this committee and Congress for working together to pass the USMCA. We must continue to push for similar policies with other trade partners. It's up to each of us to push for fair, open trade policies that provide a foundation to help advance American interests. Thank you for your continued commitment to stronger, deeper, and more meaningful relationships around trade to help us get there.
Thank you very much. Mr. Spear?
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and subcommittee members. For 87 years, the American Trucking Association remains the largest national trade organization representing the trucking industry. Trucking moves 70% of the nation's freight tonnage, worth over $10 trillion. More than 80% of U.S. communities rely exclusively on trucks for their freight needs. The trucking industry is 7.7 million strong, accounting for 1 in every 18 jobs in the United States, where a truck driver is the top job in 29 states. Our industry is critical to trade, and trade is critical to trucking. Since NAFTA took effect in 1995, truck-transported trade between the U.S. and both Mexico and Canada increased 191%, including a 178% gain in U.S. exports to both countries. Annually, that equates to over 12 million truck entries and a staggering value of more than $772 billion. Today, 76% of the surface trade with Mexico and Canada is moved by truck. In other words, trade and trucking are synonymous, and both mean jobs. The new USMCA is expected to grow our economy by $68.1 billion, resulting in 175,000 new U.S. jobs. For trucking, USMCA directly supports 90,000 employees, including 60,000 U.S. truck drivers. That's $3.25 billion in wages alone. Add in health insurance, retirement, and paid time off, and no college degree required, and all the debt that comes with it. Trucking supports countless other jobs too, including suppliers, shippers, farmers, and manufacturers. What's all this growth mean? To handle these massive increases in freight, there must be parity between trade, security, and infrastructure policy. Without it, expect longer wait times at border crossings, increased supply chain and transportation costs, and losses to output, wages, jobs, and tax revenues as companies, suppliers, and consumers spend less. According to the GSA, funding lags between project design and construction add costs and delays, and years of underinvestment in ports of entry have now left them with a $5 billion funding deficit. As examples in my written testimony, I've got 3 slides. I could pick any port. I chose 2 that I've spent time in, Port of Laredo for this illustration. This is day 1 of truck-transported trade leaving the Port of Laredo. There's day 3, there's day 7, just out of that one port of entry. Now, if any of you have been there, you can attest that the trucks entering that port of entry appear to be a sea of trucks sitting and emitting while they wait to get in and through that port of entry and on their way to their final destination. So it's a choke point, and it's impactful, not just in Texas, not just Laredo, but throughout the country. Second illustration is the Port of New Jersey and New York. This is before the construction and automation occurred at the Port of New Jersey and New York in 2016, and this is after 2019. You can still see the red. It's essentially the same slide, okay? That's largely because the freight intermodal connectors remain largely neglected. In short, parity in trade, security, and infrastructure policy would establish harmony throughout the supply chain, growing the economy, jobs, and our quality of life, without compromising our way of life. Citing the old adage, cash is king, the ATA doesn't come to you with hat in hand. Instead, we're willing to pay more. Here's why. Trucks are just 4% of the vehicles on our roads. We pay half the tab into the Highway Trust Fund. Trucking now loses $70 billion each year sitting in congestion. That's 425,000 truck drivers sitting idle for an entire year. 67 million tons of CO2 being emitted. Passenger vehicles now lose $1,600 a year due to traffic and repairs. These are the costs of inaction. Under ATA's Build America Fund, increasing the federal fuel tax by 1 nickel annually over 4 years would generate $340 billion in new revenue, shores up the Highway Trust Fund, and wouldn't add a dime to the deficit. It's immediate, it's conservative, less than 1 penny on the dollar to administer, versus up to 35 cents for tolling. In closing, business and labor came together in support of USMCA, and we're here again, united on how to fund infrastructure. Our task is clear. It's to set the differences aside and do what's right for America. Please join us by doing the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Campbell?
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Buchanan, for this opportunity to testify today. Thanks also to Ranking Member Kevin Brady for his support of Port Houston. I'm Rick Campo, and I serve as the Port Commission Chairman of the Port of Houston Authority. In my professional life, I'm Chairman and CEO of Camden Property Trust, one of the largest multifamily real estate companies in America. And Mr. Chairman, I share the great love for Oregon from your home state, having been a graduate of Oregon State University, which my wife and my son and my nephew have been as well. My wife was born in Portland, so we spent a lot of time up there. During the last 20 years, I've worked on over $6 billion worth of public-private partnerships, including Minute Maid Park, NRG Stadium, Toyota Center, 2 1,000-room convention center hotels, and ultimately bringing the Super Bowl to Houston in 2017. The Houston Ship Channel is in critical national piece of trade infrastructure. The Houston Ship Channel needs to be deepened and widened in order to expand trade and drive jobs in the region. We are building partnerships with the federal government and private industry to deliver an expanded waterway faster and with less cost than the normal federal process. Port Houston was the first major cost-sharing project in the nation where local folks contributed half of the money to build the project in 1914. It took 3 years to build that project when the Deepwater Channel was opened. And clearly today, public-private partnerships are important in the process. Houston is the top U.S. port for exports, helping Texas remain the top exporting state. It is the #1 energy port and the largest exporter of crude. The Port of Houston is home to the largest refineries in the country, the nation's largest petrochemical manufacturing complex, and the largest container facilities in the Gulf Coast. The complex sustains 3 million U.S. jobs, provides $802 billion of economic value, and generates $38 billion of tax revenues. The Houston Ship Channel is the busiest waterway in the country. 9,000 ships call to the port each year, resulting in 20,000 annual ship movements, on top of 200,000 barge movements. This traffic is more than the 3 largest ports combined, which would be Long Beach, LA, and New York, New Jersey. The dynamics of the U.S. economy as well continues, and global trends continue to put upward pressure on the waterway. The domestic oil and gas industry is seeing tremendous growth and changes in the last decade, including the lifting of the crude export ban. These changes have led to tens of billions of dollars of investments and U.S. energy independence. There's a significant demand for these projects in emerging economies around the world, and these global markets are increasingly important as domestic demand for hydrocarbons continue to decrease. Every incremental hydrocarbon production that we have in America now must be exported. Without an improved Houston Ship Channel, we will experience significant supply chain disruptions that will have national negative economic implications. The increased oil and petrochemical exports will add $55 billion towards a positive trade balance in the years to come. Since the passage of the USMCA agreement, interests of American workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses will be better served with a more open global marketplace. 20% of all trade with Mexico goes through the Houston Ship Channel. We expect, as a result of the passage of the new trade agreement, for that to increase dramatically over the next 2 or 3 years. Since 2010, Port Houston has been planning improvements to the waterway. The federal feasibility study started in 2014, and we anticipate the Chief's report from the Army Corps of Engineers this April. We're working with your colleagues on the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee to authorize the project in the upcoming WRDA bill. With traditional federal process for a navigation project like ours, we would expect an improved channel by 2030 at best. This would result in a 16-year process. In 1911, it took 5 years for the process. The Houston Ship Channel and the Texas economy and national economy can't wait. Here's what we're doing to meet the demand. The Port Authority and private companies are committed to taking the components of the federal responsibility, including private funding. The Port Authority is currently designing the project and contributing $28 million of local funds to the Corps of Engineers, taking 2 years out of the project. The Corps of Engineers has been working tirelessly to help with this project. Ultimately, the project is about safety. We need to widen the channel now and ultimately create broader positions for trade and export business. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Mr. Spear, you have outlined some of the concerns and proposals from the American trucking industry. I referenced a moment ago legislation that we had that would look at having a freight transportation infrastructure trust fund that would be financed through a national 1% way-bill fee on transportation costs of goods. Could you reflect on whether or not that's consistent with your approach and whether that's something that ought to be explored?
It is, and we're very open to how this revenue stream is used and applied to near-term projects, but also long-term. And I think that's very consistent with what we've been advocating, is a sustainable source that is leveraging users of infrastructure. We want all users to pay. And the revenue is there, and I think the national polls, when you talk to people that use infrastructure, are very supportive. Majority support funding infrastructure if they know the money they're paying goes into it. And we believe over the next 10 years that the user fee is the best, most conservative model to doing that. Beyond that, we also believe the next 10 years, we as industry, labor, with Congress need to begin discussion on what the future is going to look like beyond 10 years. The user fee is not sustainable long term. There needs to be a technology-based solution, and we need to leverage that. And that discussion should start now, not 10 years from now. Then we're really reacting. But we believe for the next 5, 10 years, this is the type of model that could appropriately fund infrastructure by leveraging user funding, and we would support that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reagan, do you want to just elaborate for a moment about how we address these challenges in a way that enhances the rights and the capacity of working men and women who are essential to our being able to put these pieces together?
Sure. It's no accident that transportation jobs are largely middle-class jobs, that they're jobs that people can raise families on. That's because the investments we've been making in infrastructure have strong labor protections attached to them, whether it be 13C on the transit side, Davis-Bacon, Buy America. We know that we are building a better economic capacity when we're making investments with strong labor policies attached to it. And that's been true across the board. Likewise, we have high union density, more collective bargaining in the transportation sector, whether it be aviation or rail or transit. And as a result, we have people that are able to make a real middle-class living with the investments that we're making from a federal perspective and also from the state and local level as well.
Mr. Robinholt, Mr. Richardson, appreciate your being here representing the airline industry, the sector. I alluded to, and you've referenced, passenger facility charges, which have been unchanged for a couple of decades, but have given you the potential of meeting some of these urgent needs and trying to keep up. If there was flexibility granted to local airport authorities, what would be the opportunity to leverage those funds on a broader scale? Can you give us a sense of what difference that would make if you had an extra dollar that you could levy on your priorities?
Mr. Chairman, the PFCs really are one of the mechanisms in which we have to develop the overall capital program for airports. So being able to have those additional dollars, it's part of the exercise of how we see ourselves in the overall air travel ecosystem. We want to retain or remain as cost-effective as we can as an airport. The PFCs allow us to do projects that are for the good, in our opinion, of the entire airport. Sometimes that may be in opposition to a single airline or two. That flexibility allows us to ensure that we're doing things for the benefit of the airport and the overall community. So having that flexibility also then allows us to keep those costs low, which also encourages competition and other airlines to come in and hopefully keep the price of the airfare down as well. So it's the combination of all of these things that we see as the benefits of the PFC increase, which allows us then to continue moving forward with the safety and security and the passenger facilitation aspects related to this infrastructure competition or competitiveness that we're dealing with. We have to figure out ways in which to allow the facilitation of people to flow through the airports to be improved, because that is the customer service element that more and more is becoming critical to how people see and go through airports.
Robin Hope?
Chairman Blumenauer, one of my favorite sayings from the port sector is, you've seen one port, you've seen one port. And so what you'll find across ports is they're all different in different ways, but as opposed to the scale of 100 or so million passengers, PDX is 20 million passengers a year, and a $1 increase would be levied on the in-planing, i.e. the passengers leaving Portland. So for us, that's about $10 million a year. That's a really meaningful portion of our capital improvement plan, and for us, that means improvements in how passengers flow, how you deal with security, a lot of these technology challenges. So for us, that's really about enabling work that we're just trying to keep up with at this stage. And as you said, it's the early 2000s when we last adjusted the PFC. We're long since due for catching up, even just with inflation, to get more juice behind our capital improvement plan.
Thank you. And I appreciate your referencing resilience. These are issues I know for all of you. The notion you're dealing in a location that potentially you're dealing with floods, you're dealing with earthquakes. If you had the ability to adjust that local in-planing fee, would that enable you to get started on a resilience agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would help us. Some of the PFC dollars would not be able to be used on a runway. They're sort of the color of money questions at airports, but it would absolutely help address a lot of those needs around the airport and around resiliency more broadly. It's something we're thinking about every day, and it's not just aviation for us. It includes sedimentation in the channel on our marine business, access to road and rail infrastructure from forest fires and landslides. There are a lot of resiliency questions where I think some infusion of additional tools would help ports more broadly.
Thank you. Mr. Campbell, Ms. Brown, I wonder if you might reflect for a moment in terms of what we need to do in terms of the congestion challenges you face in broadly in terms of the people you represent, and more narrowly in terms of, I guess you testified that you have more throughput than the next three largest ports in the country. The impact of the problems of congestion for trade and the people you represent.
Go ahead. Okay. Absolutely. So congestion is a huge issue because when you're talking about creating jobs, you have to increase the trade, you have to increase exports in order to create jobs. So congestion just slows everything down. And the Houston Ship Channel is a classic example of an infrastructure artery that is clogged. Today we're turning away ships that are over 1,100 feet. So higher TEU or container ships can't come in if they're over 1,100 feet. Otherwise, they create one-way traffic, which means that traffic can't go out when they're coming in. It's a huge issue. As I mentioned, the supply chain disruption, when you start thinking about energy exports have doubled in the last 2 years and going to double again in the next couple of years. And those energy products that have to go out, they have to get out and be exported. Otherwise, the backup in the supply chain hits refineries, pipelines, and ultimately goes to the oil fields where the energy comes from. And so that can create job dislocations along that supply chain. And we know that the demand for hydrocarbons is going down in America, but still going up in the developing world. And the interesting thing about that is that when you think about climate change and what have you, the export of LNG and other petrochemical products are being used by third world countries to replace burning of tires and coal and wood. So it's actually important for the environment to be able to export these goods to create jobs. Now, ultimately, you have to invest in those infrastructure projects in order to make sure that we don't have that supply chain backup.
Ms. Brown?
And I would add to a lot of what Mr. Campos just said in terms of the effect that it has on jobs and production. Obviously, if there's nowhere for the products to go, there's a log jam, so production is definitely decreased. But I would also like to kind of tack onto the climate issue that was just raised. I think about the Gulf region. Our union is the largest union in the refining sector. We have 30,000 members in refining. And back in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, literally shut down a good portion of the refining facilities and the petrochemical facilities in the Gulf, and broadly throughout the economy, we lost about $450 billion throughout the economy. Our members were out of work. There were ships that were idled out at sea, and the period that these refineries were down was August 24th to about September 15th. And, you know, that definitely had a broad economic impact on the Gulf region, but more broadly the economy, but also it had a climate impact. Because when refineries have to shut down unexpectedly, the emissions that are associated with that shutdown are significant. So in terms of the resilience question, there's a lot that needs to be done around these ports to try to avoid what happened in Texas in 2017 as much as possible in terms of the broad effect it had across the U.S. economy, not just in Texas and the Gulf region.
Thank you very much. Mr. Buchanan?
I want to thank all of our witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, you brought up, we have a current deficit of about, I thought he said $2 trillion, but being from Florida, I represent the west coast of Florida, or not the whole west coast, but Sarasota up the Tampa area. It's not just about current needs, it's about the future needs of the next, 20, 30 years. If you look at Florida with its growth, 1,000 people a day moving into Florida. It's a big issue. I know we have 14 ports. They're expanding, growing. They create 1 in 5 jobs. And then on top of it, our airport locally, where we didn't have a lot of growth, but the last couple of years, it's the second fastest growing airport in Sarasota in the country. So I can just see it. I see it everywhere in my district. I'm sure all around the state, there's a lot of growth. So I'm very concerned, not just about current, but future needs. The other observation, as I shared the other day, when I first came here, I was in the Transportation Committee for 4 years, and that was 12 years ago. So we've been talking about this stuff for the last 12 years. Anybody that's been around long enough, I'm sure most of you have, enough's enough. We've got to find a way on a bipartisan basis to come together and get some things done. The administrations, they'll get something. If we can get something done here, we can get something done the next level on the Senate. But I really do think the time is now, and so I appreciate all of you being up here. Mr. Campbell, let me mention one of the big issues when we did an infrastructure bill or try to do something was they called shovel-ready projects. But you mentioned when they first built the port in Houston, I think it took 2 to 3 years. And now you brought up it take you 10 years to get to 2030. What is just your sense as chairman of that Port Authority, what do you find how long it takes to get something done when you have a vision, you need to do it, you need to get in front of it because of the growth, government requirements and the bureaucracy and everything else? Give us your sense of what that looks like.
Well, clearly there's a fair amount of government bureaucracy. So you have 2 pieces of it, maybe 3 pieces. The first piece is the study. It's taken us nearly 5 years to do the study, which is, do you need it, how you need it, what should it be? And in that study, models are used that actually don't take into account really critical things, like, for example, safety and widening. So when you go through the modeling process, the Corps of Engineers designed a project that would be roughly a 2-lane road through the Gulf and then turn into 1-lane road because they don't take into account safety or widening in their scoring of the project. So that time frame that it takes and the modeling that is used takes a long time, and it should be streamlined dramatically.
Let me ask you the other thing real quick because we've got a limited time.
Okay.
You talked about private-public partnerships, outside investments. I know in our port in Manatee County, that's a big aspect of our growth there is outside companies and private funding. Has that made a big difference in the Houston port historically or currently?
It has, absolutely. In the past, the private industry has stepped up and done maintenance dredging where it needed to be done. Also, in this current widening project, industry has agreed to put in $500 million on a $1 billion project cost. The challenge we have with it is that the federal mechanisms to allow that money to come in are complicated and uncertain. So industry is willing to pay. The challenge is we don't know how to exactly do it, and that's one of the challenges that we have.
Thank you. I want to ask Mr. Spear real quick. You touched on, I hear what you're saying about, especially you see it in Florida, but I'm sure all over the country. But someone that's been in that industry, transportation, my son's in it now, I see it clearly, quickly, the electrification of cars, electric vehicles, trucks, and not just cars, but trucks. That's the future. It seems to be the future. The industry's making big investments in terms of that. How do you account for that? Or you touched on it a little bit, but how do we make sure that they're paying their fair share, so to speak?
Well, I think you look at electrification. It is promising. We see it entering the market both on the passenger but also on the commercial vehicle side. But it's based on the business model. We're a very diverse industry. For long haul, it's not going to be a widely used means of energy, largely because of the absence of infrastructure to charge that commercial vehicle. Now, if you're a regional, like a less than truckload, your equipment is back every night. It's just going local or regional. We have a lot of members that are equipping their facilities with alternative power. So electric, hydrogen, compressed natural gas. We're seeing a lot of that appear more prevalent in the more local regionalized models. It's going to take time. You need infrastructure for the charging. It is promising. I do think you need to start now and capture those users into the equation. They shouldn't be getting off scot-free just simply because they bought a different alternative fuel source.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Congressman Pascrell.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I believe the Ways and Means Committee can lead efforts for a robust federal investment in our nation's infrastructure, and I thank the panel. Each of you have clarified and communicated a stark relationship between the infrastructure and international commerce and all commerce. My district in North Jersey is all too familiar with needing to invest in the infrastructure. In my district, I have clogged roadways, decrepit bridges, congested airports, aging freight rail lines. With cargo coming into nearby Port Newark in the intersection of I-95 and I-80, we have the worst trucking bottleneck in the country in Fort Lee, New Jersey, near the George Washington Bridge. And when I say aging, our infrastructure is often many decades, if not nearly a century old. Federal funding is needed to improve our roads, our bridges, and railroads so products made in America can be shipped and exported around the world. But these investments must be made with good-paying American jobs that purchase American materials. As some of you brought out, depending upon the working conditions and the standards in other countries, this affects how we're trading and what are the results of those trades. And I'm very, very sensitive to that issue because we continue to export American companies and jobs to other places other than our own domestic land. These investments need to be as resilient as possible to mitigate against the impacts of climate change. The world is warming. We must take this threat seriously. The Moving Forward Framework Democrats announced achieves these goals. It would spur 10 million jobs, reduce greenhouse gases, and improve economic security. Finally, the best trading infrastructure in the world will not do us a lick of good if we do not have partners to trade with or goods to export. The President's trade chaos has hurt relations with our allies, American workers, and our bottom line. The U.S. trade deficit is up significantly in the last 3 years. U.S. job outsourcing has continued, and the manufacturing sector's 4-year employment boom that started a few years ago has flatlined last year. We cannot lose sight of these problems. So let me ask this question, Ms. Brown. American families and businesses bear the economic consequences of continued failure to invest in our nation's crumbling infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates hardworking American families lose upwards of $3,400 in disposable income each year we fail to address our infrastructure needs. $3,400 in disposable income. How would investments on our nation's infrastructure benefit American families and workers, in your mind?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Pascrell. You know, some of us were discussing earlier how infrastructure is just one of those unique issues, especially today, that is uniquely bipartisan. And it's something that we all agree is necessary for us to make investments in, no matter the party, no matter whether you're labor or industry. And it's because, from a worker's perspective, a $1 billion investment in infrastructure creates 20,000 jobs throughout the U.S. economy. You mentioned the Moving Forward framework. The amount of jobs throughout the states that would be created with that type of investment over a 5-year period would be critical. I could just speak to our members. You know, in steel, at our rubber facilities, at our aluminum smelters, on average, our members are paid roughly $80,000 plus benefits. That's real income, jobs that would benefit greatly if that investment were made and if preferences were made to source domestically.
So you don't need a magnifying glass to go respond to this question. I mean, we're talking, and we've talked about this. The chairman has brought us together a couple of times on this issue. Very critical. And today we're talking about the relationship with trade. Then why, if we have it's bipartisan, we have labor involved, we have commerce involved, why can't we get anything done?
This is the question that we can't answer. It's, you know, I wish that we could. It is meat that has been left on the table. This is a phrase that we have been using within the labor community about this issue, and that's why we appreciate this hearing. Hopefully this will drive some action.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every member of this committee, the subcommittee, and the committee understands that now that we have done tax reform, we've done the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and have a very big start on the China trade agreement, that we are now on the edge of a bursting economy, and that then will fall directly in all of your laps, because we are on the edge of it. You're the guys that at the end of the day have to deliver all the result of that economy. I have a district that the very heart of it is the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and so I see that every time I take off and land. Every flight is full. Airports have restricted gates. The airlines can't seem to get enough gates. And my question has more to do with how you use, how your technical, your digital services all tie together. And are you falling behind in that? Are you allowed to use your landing fees or the money that you get from the government now? And I think I'll direct my questions towards the 3 airport people. How do you fund that digital part of it that is so important, that communicates with the other airports and the truckers and everybody that kind of ties the whole thing together? How do you fund that digital part of your business, Mr. Richardson?
Well, that's an interesting question. So most of the funding that's going to come through the airport for digital, as you're describing it there, which is what I would consider more of our information technology backbone, is really going to be funded by the airport itself. And there are aspects of it that will be part of what I would refer to as the rates and charges that are reimbursed to us by the airlines. But a lot of that is going to be the infrastructure, at least from Atlanta's perspective, that we would consider to be the benefit of the entire community, and we would build that infrastructure necessary to have that communication. You raised an interesting concept about the communication amongst the various groups, cargo and whatever else. Those corridors, as we refer to them, are critical now to that development of that cargo component, so that we know the items that are coming to us, so that the truckers recognize when they should be at their cargo hold place to come and get their goods, so that there's not this tremendous weight that's being placed on the roadways. So that funding is really being done by the airports, with some help by the airlines through rates and charges, but it's really funded, at least in our part, by the airport itself.
Mr. Ravenhoff.
The situation's similar for us. I think it's worth noting some of the technology, say the security technology used by TSA or CBP, is oftentimes we get support from the federal government for that aspect. Airlines do some of their own investment as well. For example, an Atlanta-based airline using facial recognition at check-in is a great tool. They are funding that themselves, but we also charge through our rates and charges structure. Essentially, they pay rent at the airport that helps fund our operation, and that's what we do for a lot of the ticketing infrastructure, the flight information displays, the parking is paid for by parkers or people with cars. So we try to make sure it's a relatively fee-based on the user themselves who end up funding that.
Mr. Campbell, can you give me an example of a successful public-private partnership that you've been able to pull together for the Port of Houston that would serve as a model for any kind of legislation that we would look at doing?
We have a number of private-public partnerships. One would be with railroads, where we partnered with railroad companies to provide spurs and additional railroad access, and that's a great model because a private railroad company contributing capital, the Port of Houston contributing capital to improve infrastructure through rail. That's a good example.
Okay, thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this very important hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony. But, Mr. Chairman, I want to especially thank you for the leadership you've shown in trying to keep Congress's focus, really the nation's focused on this long overdue investment in our infrastructure system as a country. And it is going to require some tough bipartisan compromises to get it done. But I represent a district, large rural area in western Wisconsin that has more miles along the Mississippi than any other congressional district in the nation. So I tend to appreciate the needs of our inland waterway infrastructure system in light of the importance of agriculture exports. 92% of all exports are emanating from that larger Mississippi River basin in Middle America. Roughly 78% of all the feed grains and soybeans, most of the livestock and hogs coming from this area. 60% of the egg exports heading down through the Port of New Orleans, southern Louisiana. And yet, Ms. Brown, when we built the lock and dam system, and I have 6 of them in my congressional district, back in the 1930s, it was the 50-year shelf life. Right. Here we are, 2020, approaching the 100th anniversary of the lock and dam system. I'm worried about the state of our inland waterway infrastructure and the impact it has on trade and commerce generally throughout the country. Are you seeing similar type of concerns yourself and the need for focus in this area?
We are. Thank you for the question, Congressman Kind. And in your district in particular, we have roughly 2,300 members across a suite of industries, including pulp and paper and chemicals and others, who really rely on a strong inland transportation system to move their products. But there are these very significant log jams for a series of reasons, dredging and others. And, you know, overall, 60% of our inland waterways and our ports are 50 years old or more. And so this is a challenge that we've been trying to work through, actually through the Ways and Means Committee, through WRDA. We've been trying to really push for investment in getting some of these ports dredged. But we remain in kind of a logjam situation in this.
Let me ask you this question on that same topic. Obviously, in the Upper Miss, we're very proud of the multiple use resource that we have, from commercial nav to recreation to tourism. And we've always been careful trying to maintain that delicate balance. But you know, back in the 30s, a 600-foot lock system may have made sense then, given the volume and given the barge traffic. But today, it is a lot of log jams, a lot of breaking of these barges, a lot of hours wasted waiting to push that all through. So there's been talk about extending that to a 1,200-foot type of lock and dam system. Now, naturally, those in the recreation and tourism industry get a little bit concerned about the eco impact of larger barges running up and down the river. But what are your thoughts as far as the need to expand some of the dams to accommodate larger barges?
You know, that's a complicated issue. It's one that we really are thinking about within the Steelworkers, because we have heard from industry that there is a need. We haven't officially crafted a position yet, but it's something that we're happy to talk to you more about.
Well, there's a unique funding mechanism, too, with the Inland Waterway Trust Fund, where you've got the commercial nav users who are willing to contribute to it. In fact, they want to pay more into it, but for some reason, the negotiations are stymied. We haven't been able to find a landing zone. How important do you think it is to continue pushing those discussions to reach an agreement on what the appropriate fee-based level should be for infrastructure needs?
It's absolutely critical. I mean, we're talking about getting the products that American workers get up every morning to make every single day for the economy and throughout, you know, kind of the global trading scheme out. And that's not happening at an efficient rate.
Yeah.
So it's critical that this happens.
You know, one thing that jumped out at me in your opening statement, it's just so true, that when we're talking infrastructure needs of our country, it's not just the bricks and mortar, but it's the human infrastructure
That's
investment that we need. And we haven't really paid too much attention to the fact that if we do move forward on a major infrastructure investment, where are the workers going to come from?
Right.
I mean, we're almost at full employment right now, and when I visit businesses large and small in my state, their number one concern is workforce needs, being able to get qualified people or trainable people through the door in order to meet the expansion. And I'm concerned, especially given how deadlocked we are in Congress over a sensible immigration policy. We don't have a baby boom happening in our country right now, and yet we're virtually at full employment, and our immigration policy is tied up in knots. So I'm concerned, and I'm hoping that we all can be thinking a little bit through the human capital that's going to be required to pull this off as well. Otherwise, we can appropriate money, but it might be hard to find those jobs. Mr. Spear, I've got Martin, I've got Schneider. When I visit them, they're always concerned about the trucking workforce and their needs as well. So this is across the board, and we're going to have to pay more attention as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My goal in Congress is to make America competitive, and I don't believe we can have a world-class competitive economy if we don't have world-class infrastructure. But I do believe that a lot of the problems with our infrastructure investment are placed upon us by ourselves. I also know for a fact it's not an issue or question. There's no doubt about the fact that the Highway Trust Fund, which was last changed in 1993 and wasn't indexed, has lost 40% of its purchasing power. And if you think 18 cents today buys the same thing that 18 cents on the gallon bought in 1993, then you don't understand inflation and you don't understand math. Those are just facts. But Mr. Spear, I want to ask you for a minute. The truckers propose a 20 cents increase in the gas tax over 4 years. I believe that's what I heard you said.
That's correct.
Do you think the average motorist knows that 20% of the highway, the gas tax is diverted to mass transit and not put in highway?
I couldn't say how many people really realize that. I think a lot of people, when you ask them, you know, what you pay at the pump, if it goes back into infrastructure, do you support it? And the answer is generally yes. Now, if you start splitting it apart, transit, you know, I think candidly we testified here last year and we had the same discussion. But you know, just to reiterate, this really comes down to support in Congress.
Where do you
and you've got a lot of Democrats up here that have transit, and it's very important that they're not in rural areas. And
so I think what I hear you saying is that you don't necessarily support that, but you recognize that in order to get support to pass a change in the gas tax, that you have to support diverting 20% of it to transit.
That's correct. Now, I would not support you know, playing with that formula. I think both need With the amount of congestion, both need investments. You need more commuters on transit to
Wouldn't it make
alleviate
sense-
the congestion, and I think the funding formulas are still very important, and that split represents that.
I think Mr. Robenhold, you were talking earlier about the fact that what's it called, the port, the inland, what's it, the port
Passenger
maintenance trust
facility
fund?
charge?
What's it called? Harbor
Passenger
maintenance trust fund.
Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, yes.
You know, both those, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, is that money that's taken in every year, is it applied every year to actually deepening ports?
It's not, Congressman.
You know, the problem with both those things, the Highway Trust Fund and the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and pretty much any federal trust fund, the Social Security Trust Fund, the problem with federal trust funds is they're not funded and you can't trust them. And if we actually use the money for what we tell the public in the title of it, if we actually use the money for those things, then we wouldn't be facing a lot of the problems that we're facing. Mr. Campbell, you were talking about the process of permitting the deepening of the port in Houston. I have a desperate need for an interstate in my district, I-73. It was designated as a highway of national significance, which means it should be brought to the front of the line, and that was done in 1993. And it took until about 3 years after I got in Congress, about 3 years ago, we finally got it permitted. And under the law, anybody within 180 days after a permit is issued can bring a lawsuit to enjoin the construction and challenge the permit. So on the 175th day, an environmental group in my district did that. That was 3 years ago, and the suit's still pending. Does it make much sense to you that after the Corps of Engineers studies a project for 5 years and every federal agency, you know, the EPA and federal highways and everybody else looks at the project, and then the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and the Highway Department and everybody works to agree on mitigation? Does it make sense to you that just anybody can come along and pay $1,000 and hold up $1 billion project for years on end?
It does not.
Okay, and how long did you say you'd been working on getting the deepening of the Port of Houston?
We started working on it in 2010. The study started in 2014, and we're completing the study in April of this year.
Okay, I only have about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to have to rush through this. But is there any doubt, given the level of traffic in the Port of Houston, that ultimately it's going to determine that it's feasible to deepen the Port of Houston?
Yes, absolutely.
And so honestly, what we're doing is a tremendous waste of time and money and cost. I mean, it runs the cost up tremendously. And so for us to sit here and say that, you know, A, we're not using the money properly, we're diverting money and we're not spending it when we get it on these trust funds, and then that we're spending it, throwing it away needlessly on studies that in the end, everybody knows what the result is going to be. You know, we've got a lot of improvement before we can look the American public in the eye and tell them we need to raise the tax on this trust fund or that trust fund. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rice. At this point, we will switch to recognizing two Democratic interrogators for each Republican, consistent with past committee practices and trying to get through the list. Mr. Davis, you're next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my commendation to you for the tremendous leadership that you have provided, pushing and keeping the issue of infrastructure need before the entire body, and I appreciate that leadership. Let me also thank all of our witnesses for coming and sharing their concepts, ideas, experiences, and notions. You know, it occurs to me as we talk about this issue, I've never encountered a person who didn't believe that we don't need to improve our infrastructure. Every elected official that I know, whether they are appointed, elected, whether they're local, whether they're statewide, doesn't matter. Everybody believes that there is something that we need to do. We also know the benefits, and we have some ideas about what will happen to us if we don't. But it seems that when we get to the point of how do we accomplish it, how do we pay for it, then this becomes a sticking point. And since we're celebrating African American History Month, I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass, who was fond of saying that there was one thing he knew if he didn't know anything else, and that is that in this world, you may not get everything that you pay for, but you will most certainly pay for everything that you get. And if you don't pay one way, then you will pay another way. And I think that we're at the point where we must recognize that if we don't pay one way, then we're paying in a negative fashion another way by all of the things that we deny and all of the things that we prevent. In the discussion, there's a concept that has emerged that every user should pay, that everybody ought to contribute in some way, shape, form, or fashion based upon their using and the benefit that they will receive. Chairman Blumenauer mentioned an infrastructure bank a little bit. There's been some other conceptualization of that. Let me ask quickly, and since we've only got 2 minutes for each one of us to respond in, could you, Mr. Campos, begin and tell me, what do you think of this idea of an infrastructure bank where the resources are put in? You don't have to come up with an appropriation every year. You don't have to do single projects, and you've already got the mechanisms in place to make this happen.
I think it'd be a great idea. I think user-driven, that's funded by users using the infrastructure, is definitely an important thing. When you think about the ship channel, the Harbor Trust Fund is only charged to importing companies, but not exporting companies. So a ship that comes in pays the fee, a ship that goes out doesn't pay the fee, but the ship that goes out has the same infrastructure uses as the ship comes in. So absolutely fees.
Mr. Spear?
I think in the end, if it's a bank, if it's the trust fund, you're still going to have to pull the trigger and fund it. And that's going to require consensus. You're going to have to reach out on both sides and figure out what's the best formula for getting the job done. It's going to have urban versus rural members representing their interests. That's how we ended up with this funding formula on transit. That was decided by you all, and it got the job done. And you know, I think regardless of what structure you put in place to fund it year over year, it's got to be made whole.
Robin Holt?
Congressman, yes, absolutely. I think there have been several tools discussed over the last 8 or 10 years in Congress, Green Bank, Investment Bank, absolutely good tools. I think what we'd advocate is a number of arrows in the quiver. One solution is not going to fit for everyone, but the more opportunities you have for funded possibilities is better.
Mr. Richardson?
Again, I think the concept is very valid. I think the issue that would probably be there is once it's in that fund, where the decision-making body is that decides what the projects will be that are actually going to be used. And that's where I would say if it's more in the local hands, like a PFC is, then that it gets it more to the direct benefit of the users.
Mr. Reagan?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Mr. Spear said. It needs to be funded. I think that's going to be the bottom line, and we're supportive to any financing options that are going to put real money into our infrastructure. We're going to be supportive of. We also believe it needs to be attached to the right federal policies that ensure that we are protecting the workforce in these environments as well.
Ms. Brown?
I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, there's no silver bullet. It's going to take a suite of things and tools to get to what we need. I would also add that putting a price on carbon would be another good way of funding a lot of these infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. Now you're back.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity to once again highlight the need for infrastructure as well as the potential for the proper infrastructure investment and how we pay for it. Gentlemen and ma'am, thank you very much for being here. Your preparation as well as your testimony today. I hail from the Central Coast of California, so we got a lot of trade, we got a lot of tourism. We got a lot of beauty, we got a lot of bounty, and both of those rely on proper infrastructure. When it comes to our products, our agriculture, we rely a lot on trucking, some shipping when we eventually get there, but it's trucking out of our fields, trucking out of our producing companies, and then trucking when it goes to our 1 and 2 and 3 trading partners. Our beauty definitely relies on our airports, getting people in to our area. It also relies on our roads as well. But unfortunately, as we've heard, and I think we know, this isn't a problem just isolated to the Central Coast of California. A lot of these facets of our economy are undermined by our aging infrastructure. Upgrades to that infrastructure, as we've heard from you, and I think you're going to hear from many of us up on this dais, must be made, not only to increase sustainability and resiliency, but also to combat climate change and adapt to its consequences. You mentioned the USMCA, and some people have mentioned USMCA. I have to tout the fact that it provides for over $300 million for their border water infrastructure program to address wastewater pollution at the California-Mexico border. I also have to tout that it provides $215 million for the North American Development Bank and additional funding for marine debris cleanup. This type of funding really is a model for ensuring the flow of goods does not increase pollution, and it aids our trading partners in addressing their own environmental challenges. Upgrading our infrastructure can, as we know well, increase trade, increase tourism, protect our environment, and adapt to climate change, and yes, create jobs. So I'm happy that we're having this hearing today, but obviously we want to talk about issues as to how we can afford to invest in our trucking is where I'm concerned, Mr. Spear. You know, I like what you said. You know, the ATA doesn't normally come with open hands. You want to be a partner. You want to work to get things done. So talk to me about what the trucking industry is doing to increase efficiency and reduce emissions.
I think one compelling fact is that a brand new truck right now off the lot emits the same amount of diesel particulate matter that 60 trucks emitted in 1988. So modern equipment is not only safer, it's more energy efficient, it's better on the environment. Yet, as I said in my opening statement, we're still sitting in traffic, losing $70 billion every year at these top 100 bottlenecks alone. That's 67 million tons of CO2 because of congestion. I'm not picking on the Port of New York, New Jersey. I can do Port of LA and Long Beach. If you do not invest in the intermodal connectors, it doesn't matter how much money you pour into that port, dredging, automation, all those things are great, but if you do not have flow, those trucks don't move, you're still going to have a backup, bottleneck, you're going to have weighted costs on efficiency, and you're going to have damage to the environment. It's just that simple.
In that vein, I mean, are you working with other environmental stakeholders to deal with this issue, and if so, who?
Absolutely. We've been a partner with EPA. We've been at the table on phase 1, 2, and 3 on emissions, 3 being now NOx, and so we're very much a part of that in developing cleaner engines and efficiency. We're all on board on that. That's all things that we need to be doing as an industry. But again, it's parity. You've got to have good infrastructure policy to complement good environmental policy. Otherwise, you're sitting in traffic, you're still emitting. Maybe less than we did in 1988, but you're still emitting.
Yeah, and so, I mean, one of those options, though, obviously, so we don't emit, is electric trucks, as you mentioned. Elaborate on that.
Well, it's range. I mean, honestly, if you're looking at ports, if you're looking at parcel, where you're basically bringing that equipment back every evening, or just servicing, you know, urban or areas, that equipment can be charged. So an electric application is something that our industry is gravitating to, but we still do a lot of long haul. And if you're crossing, you know, my home state of Nebraska and Wyoming, you're not going to have infrastructure out there to charge those vehicles. It's not the most viable source of energy as diesel is. So, and it all comes down to the cost ratios, what's more, you know, better for your business model. So it's going to take time for that to penetrate the entire market.
Understood, and I look forward to working with you on that. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Holding?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing and bringing in this excellent panel. Very informative, learning a lot today. And we've heard from all the witnesses that in order to maximize our trading relationships, we need a strong and effective infrastructure that eases the flow of goods, services, and people in and out of our country. And we've heard a lot about ports being a vital piece of this infrastructure. In North Carolina, my state, we have 2 ports, and although they're not quite as large as what's in Houston, we do have over 6.7 million tons of goods worth $2.1 billion, which were transported through North Carolina ports in 2018. And the localities in the states and the state of North Carolina received about $700 million in property and sales taxes, and the port supported over 87,000 jobs. At the full committee hearing we had last week, I spoke about ways to incentivize private capital for infrastructure development. And as I mentioned then, I'll mention again today, Mr. Swazi and I are working on a proposal that would inject more private capital infrastructure across the U.S. by amending the discriminatory tax law known as FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment Real Estate Tax. This is something I'm committed to working on. I think it would make a big improvement. So my question is to Mr. Campbell. Again, thank you for being here today, a wealth of experience. Can you speak to any barriers you've encountered that prohibit you from making private investments to a public port like Houston? And specifically, can you give us any examples, maybe some red tape that have hindered such private investments from occurring in Houston?
Absolutely. So we are negotiating with industry right now for a $500 million contribution to the widening and deepening of the Houston Ship Channel. And the challenge we have is that given that the Ship Channel is a federal asset and controlled by the Corps of Engineers, Congress, and the Coast Guard, there isn't a great mechanism for us to use to get that $500 million infused into the project. And so the complication needs to be taken away. If you want private capital, we need to have mechanisms that allow that private capital to come in. The challenge is that a lot of federal dollars, the fees that are going to the federal government get complicated in how you charge and how users can contribute. So I think that's really the biggest issue is it's complicated and there's no real pathway to get that, or no great pathway to get those funds invested.
And when you're looking for $500 million, obviously that could take some big investors, and as you're probably aware, foreign-owned insurance companies are huge investors in infrastructure around the world and certainly would like to be investors in infrastructure here in the United States. So if certain tax barriers such as FIRPTA were removed from foreign insurance companies investing, that might be a good prospect place for you to find some capital to inject in the Port of Houston.
Absolutely. FIRPTA is definitely a barrier, one of the barriers out there, and with an enhanced FIRPTA, it would definitely help capital from foreign entities coming to the channel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Murphy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on the importance of trade infrastructure. There are so many different topics that we could discuss, but I think I'm going to focus on ports with my limited amount of time. Florida is highly dependent on international trade, which supports about 2.4 million jobs in the state. And we export about $50 billion a year in goods, with about 30,000 Florida companies importing products. And all of that helps to keep prices down for my Florida constituents. Most of what Florida imports and exports is moved by ship through ports like Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa Bay, and Canaveral, which is located very close to my Orlando district. And that port happens to employ a lot of my constituents. Given the importance of ports to Florida's economy and to Florida's quality of life, I believe any comprehensive infrastructure package that Congress advances should include investments in ports. The need to modernize our port infrastructure is well documented. In Florida, the American Society of Civil Engineers have given our ports a B- grade, so room for improvement. And investing in state-of-the-art deep-water ports is critical in ensuring that the United States meets the needs of today's largest and most sophisticated maritime vessels, while being well-positioned for the challenges of the future. And one of the most pressing challenges we face is from growing trade competition in the Western Hemisphere from China. President Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative called Belt and Road involves the investment of over $1 trillion in transportation and other infrastructure projects around the globe, including in the Western Hemisphere. For example, the Chinese are financing port construction and terminal operations in Panama, the Bahamas, Cuba, and Jamaica, all in our backyard. And this matters because large container ships from Asia and other locations can now bypass the United States and dock directly in small Caribbean islands that until recently weren't sufficiently, where the ports weren't sufficiently deep or well equipped to accommodate these vessels. And the United States stands to lose out from this development in a number of ways. First, we're going to lose the economic activity associated with transferring cargo to smaller ships bound for Latin America. And then we'll lose revenue in the form of value-added tax on all goods carried on ships that arrive in our ports, revenues that contribute to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and that pays for investments in port infrastructure. And then finally, as China links itself to our historic trading partners in the Western Hemisphere, it could gain economic and strategic influence and undermine regional stability as well as weaken U.S. export markets. Making targeted investments in our ports is going to help U.S. firms, including those in Florida, remain globally competitive in the face of this increasing Chinese competition. So, Mr. Robinhold and Mr. Campbell, what do you think the best ways for a congressional infrastructure package to support investments in ports? And then how else can the United States create competitive advantages in the maritime trade industry?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a great question. We think a lot about China and Oregon. Canada and China are our two largest trading partners for the state. A lot of that is agricultural products that are bound for China. I'd say two things. One, on the Belt and Road, you're absolutely right. This is a competition over infrastructure. That's specifically the Chinese strategy, and we're losing that battle now. And so specific infrastructure investments, modernization of facilities, it comes down to the harbors themselves, cranes, and selection of modernized equipment. I think it's also, there's a strategic question on the second hand, which is really, are we entering these discussions with China one-on-one, or are we entering with our allies? And we were in Oregon big fans of the TPP, joining with other Asian partners to get more trade moving and create essentially a front to the Chinese move into other markets around the world. I do think we need to get back on that kind of footing with our strong allies. USMCA can be a sort of a piece of a brick in that foundation. We need to align with our European allies and our other very good Asian allies to figure out how we get that value out of a relationship with China.
Thank you.
Two things. First of all, 30% of all ships in the world today are larger than 1,100 feet. Houston cannot take 1,100 feet ships. So, and the ships that are building are all larger ships because it's more efficient and you can drive costs down for consumers if you put more consumer goods on fewer ships. Two ways to improve the process that Congress can really focus on is streamline the process, because it just takes too long. 15 years to develop a project like the Houston Ship Channel is too long. The other thing is this Harbor Trust Fund we've talked about. Exporting or importing ships are paying $100 million into the trust fund in Houston, and we're getting $30 million of funds back from the trust fund to dredge, and we need $50 to $60 million to really make it work.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dobeni?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. Mr. Robinhold, I represent Washington State, and so as a Pacific Northwest neighbor, on this theme of competitiveness, I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of how competition plays, because we obviously have a big port nearby, the Port of Vancouver. We see a lot of goods and services even that are destined for the United States that are going through the Port of Vancouver. And so how does investment in infrastructure, what do you need to be competitive? What are some of the challenges that we face across the Pacific Northwest?
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a great question. We're good friends with the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. I think broadly it's the same sort of issues you've been hearing about. The dredging and the harbor maintenance tax are an important part of that conversation. But also, I think you heard from other folks here on the panel, it's this sort of interstitial fiber needs to allow for quick movement of cargo. The congestion that our ports see, that ports like Vancouver are seeing at a lower extent, is because they've really invested in transload facilities, multimodal facilities, moving from rail to truck or from truck to vessel. And that's something that I think would really help us on the West Coast compete, both with Vancouver, but also with our trading partners on the other side of the Pacific.
I think we talk a lot about the ports themselves, but we have to talk about how we get things in and out of the ports too, which is critical to moving them across the country. Mr. Spear.
Yeah, just to touch on what Curtis just said, you know, it's very important when you're crafting a congressional package, work with your governors, and the governors have to work with the local governments as well. Because a lot of those intermodal connectors that we've been talking about that are still red, those are local roads. So they're not part of a federal package. Now, they have access to grants, but it's something that I think you really need to take a hard look at when you're trying to bring in that flow from the port, make those intermodal connectors more efficient. You've got to be able to work with the states and the localities as well to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, thank you. On a different note, Mr. Richardson, you talked about using digital biometrics, things like that, when you're talking about the airport in particular. Given there's opportunities for new technologies to be used, but there are also things that we have to look at in terms of ethics and privacy and security. I wonder if you can speak to kind of how you've thought about that and how new technologies fit into how you help move passengers through the airport.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of those conversations go on throughout the United States, especially I think California has been one where they've effectively, using the term outlawed, the biometric sort of technology for airports. It's an interesting dialogue because we've got to figure out the best mechanism in which to facilitate the passengers through the process, because the expectation from passengers now is that quick entry in and out to get through and to get to where they're going. The physical facilities that exist are no longer really able to do that. So the technology has to be used to allow for that facilitation to occur. Trying to make sure that you've got the proper balance so that protection of information is secure. The information is there already. It's just how you effectively combine the use of that so that you're not necessarily using anything new or different from the individuals. You're just accessing the two different, in some cases, two different databases to connect and make sure that this person is this person and they can continue on. So there's some work that needs to be done to make sure that is protected, but I do believe that it's something that to allow for that facilitation, to know that you can't build bigger all the time. You've got to be able to use your current space more effectively, and through biometrics or through other digital means, that's going to be the only way in which we can do it.
Thank you. No, these are important discussions, and I think it's important at the federal level too. We look at issues in terms of what people's rights are in a digital world, but also that we look at issues of privacy and make sure that we have policies in place so people know what's happening with their data, how it's used, and they're able to provide consent in terms of how that's used too. So thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for kicking off 2020 with this important hearing. I think we all can agree that modernizing our infrastructure is not only just important for trade, but important for all commerce within the United States. Throughout his time in office, President Donald Trump has taken steps to create numerous opportunities for rural America. And that certainly applies to his approach with trade agreements. USMCA, the Japan Agreement, and Phase 1 of China, all of these agreements give our farmers and ranchers the edge they need to be competitive in the global market. Right now, over $1 billion in goods cross the U.S.-Mexico border each day. With the renegotiated USMCA, it will be even more. If farmers are going to get their goods to the market, they need the infrastructure to do it. That starts with what I believe in rural infrastructure. Whether it's bringing highways up to interstate grade in rural Missouri, funding for investment in small ports along the Mississippi, even rural broadband in areas that have no internet, improving bridges. These are all critical links that ensure the benefits of trade reach every corner of this country. In last week's hearing, I highlighted the President's good work in bringing sanity back to the regulatory review process, and I think that bears repeating here as well. Nowhere is the pain of the Nepa environmental review process felt more than in rural communities. In southeast Missouri, we have a highway project that has been in the works for years. The future Interstate 57 project, which brings Route 60 and 67 up to interstate grade, creating the last link between a continuous major corridor from Chicago through the Boot Hill of Missouri to Little Rock and then ultimately to Dallas. It has local support, state support, and the support of federally elected officials, not just in Missouri, but in the other states. While there are many steps left before this project is a reality, I think we can all agree that government should be enabling projects that bring economic growth to rural communities, not holding them back. Yet that's exactly what happened with the original environmental impact statement on the Interstate 57 project. It took 9 years to complete the environmental impact statement. Our rural communities can't wait 9 years for this economic activity. Sadly, this story isn't just unique to southeast Missouri and in Arkansas and in Texas. Burdensome government-mandated studies have been the #1 culprit for holding back infrastructure projects for years. But with his reforms, President Trump will put a stop to the endless red tape, paperwork, and litigation. This means more projects breaking ground at a faster rate and at a lower cost. Mr. Spear, you were at the White House for the President's announcement on streamlining the environmental review process. How will improvements to Nepa affect the trucking industry?
I think they affect the entire intermodal system largely because any project delays are just fueling congestion. We're growing faster than we have infrastructure to support. That event highlighted a couple that are worse than the ones that you did. On the east coast of North Carolina, that was a bridge project that took 30 years to permit. I know of Lake Charles, I-10 down in Louisiana, 20 years to permit. Listen, I think if you can't get this stuff done in less than 2 years, the project should not go forward, period. Just move on to something else. We just debate this stuff incessantly. But the point I'm trying to make here is that good infrastructure policy is good environmental policy. Because the amount of congestion is producing so much in CO2 emissions, I cannot understand for the life of me why we'd not want better infrastructure, more flow of traffic. It's good for the economy, it's good for the systems that we're talking about here, but it's also good for the environment and safety as well. So anything less than 2 years is sufficient. Anything beyond shouldn't even go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In March of 2003, when the United States invaded and occupied Iraq, the United States economy was 8.5 times larger than that of China. And the reason for that is while we were stuck spending $4 trillion in 2 wars in the Middle East in building roads and bridges that were destroyed by the very people that we were fighting, China was investing, as has been mentioned here, between $1 and $4 trillion rebuilding or building roads, bridges, ports, rails in Asia, Europe, and Africa, not to fight an enemy, but to facilitate trade toward the goal of benefiting that country, China, which is now a dominant global economic player. The other issue with infrastructure is that there are many benefits, and Mr. Robinhold had made reference to the environmental benefits. You're right. We have a bridge that connects Buffalo to southern Ontario. It's called the Peace Bridge. It was built 80 years ago. It's 3 lanes. It's the second busiest border crossing between the United States and Canada. Trucks are stuck there, like sometimes for 2 hours. And people talk about the negative environmental impact of having a bridge that size there. The problem is, it's not the bridge, it's the fact that the bridge is congested. Because what triggers asthma in kids is idling diesel engines. So, at its very essence, infrastructure should be used to facilitate the more efficient movement of goods and services wherever it is. But the secondary benefit, and most economists will confirm this, is that for every dollar that you spend on infrastructure, minimally, you get $1.60 back in economic growth. Unlike a tax cut where you give $1 away and you get 32 cents back. The other thing that's of concern here, which should be an urgent reminder to all of us to get an infrastructure bill done, is delay is very, very expensive. There are studies that show that if you were to do a $1 million bridge repair today, if that project were deferred or delayed for 24 months, you would increase the cost of that project by a factor of 5 beyond the base. So $1 million bridge repair will cost you $6 million 2 years from now. That is ridiculous. That is ridiculous. The other area that I really don't know a whole lot about, but it's this whole area of technology. The United States dominated in 4th generation communications. We dominated. And China, their effort was government-led. The United States process was private sector-led toward 5G technology, which is 100 times faster than 4G technology. China today has 150,000 cellular sites. The United States today has 10,000. And most economists will tell you that this 5G and 6G technology, which is emerging, will facilitate global dominance for the country that gets out in front of it. So, there's a lot that we're missing here, but it all adds up to the same thing. We will lose our global dominance in terms of the economy if we don't do something quickly to catch up. And Ms. Brown, I'm sure that the steelworkers have a lot to say about that.
Thank you so much, Congressman Higgins. And I think, you are one of the people on the dais who knows intimately about the impacts of unfair trade on domestic manufacturing, being from Buffalo and what Buffalo was in terms of manufacturing. I just say amen to everything that you just said. I think for far too long we have ceded our technological innovation, particularly in the manufacturing sector, to other nations. You look across a series of technologies and systems, and we've ceded them to the world. You mentioned 5G. Steelworkers make fiber optics in North Carolina at Corning. We make electric vehicles now in California, but we're at a very key tipping point where if we do not take the steps we need to make sure that domestic sourcing preferences apply to EVs as they're built out, we're going to cede that to China and to companies like BYD, and on the rail side, companies like CRRC. Same thing with the cranes I mentioned earlier. Right now, we don't make that size crane domestically, but why can't we? And why can't we take the steps to make sure that we are creating the space for domestic manufacturing in these places to grow so that we can capture that innovation that we have lost in so many different places?
Thank you very much. Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank all of you for sitting with us all morning, talking about two of the most crucial topics for our economic growth, trade and infrastructure. With apologies to Mr. Spear, and this is not a hostile question, I've been concerned for years about truck versus train freight stuff in Virginia. And Mr. Regan, as last I recall, we had 60% of our east-west traffic going by train, but only 10% of our north-south traffic. So I-81, I-95 are enormous competition with our trucks. I've been struck by the lack of conversation this morning about rail as part of this infrastructure, with ports, airports, trucks, and the like. And I presume part of that is because our rail system is largely owned by the companies, by CSX, by Norfolk Southern, and things like that. So, Mr. Regan, from a transportation perspective, what should we be doing as we look at the infrastructure bills to come to stimulate much more investment in rail?
Well, I think it's twofold. One is we do need to focus on intermodal connectivity, as we discussed earlier. We need to be able to make sure that our freight trains are able to connect with the rest of our infrastructure and make that final leap. So it has to be really connected with the rest of our infrastructure. It also needs to be efficiently meshed with our passenger rail system. I think real investments on our passenger rail system will help also free up and make it a more efficient for both rail and passenger. And that involves investing in our national infrastructure, national rail system. It involves investing in our stations. It involves making sure that we're not getting in each other's way when we're starting to transport people as well as goods throughout the country.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Ms. Brown, you talked about how Customs and Border Patrol had left $4.5 billion on the table in the last 2 decades in countervailing duties and anti-dumping fees. How do we provide oversight? Who do we need to bring in before the Oversight Committee to talk to? $4.5 billion is not trivial money.
It's not. Thank you so much for the question, Congressman. It's certainly not trivial money. What we understand is that the CBP is in the process of a rulemaking to try to, assess the efficiencies of their programs. But I would support what you just suggested and have a hearing to really intimately drill down into what is not working with the CBP. We're happy to talk about who might be the best witnesses, but we would strongly support that. We are leaving so much money on the table that should be going to the Treasury to potentially fund a lot of what we're talking about. So we would certainly support a hearing like that.
Yeah, thank you. As we talk about infrastructure, everyone's thinking about ways to make our infrastructure much more carbon friendly. And we look specifically at the ports. I know Savannah has been a leader in moving over to diesel-powered equipment and electric for electric cranes. San Francisco's moved to shore power, ensuring ships like cruise ships are plugged in rather than running on their own diesel fuel. We're seeing this at a lot of truck stops, where they're moving from just plug-in stuff. What can we be doing to move the electrification of ports? This is to Mr. Campo, Mr. Reinhold.
Well, I think the key is definitely supporting the infrastructure for electrification. The Port of Houston, for example, just signed a 10-year renewable electricity contract for our cranes. Our cranes are all electric, and I think that that it gets down to the same issues, which are all about process and streamlining process to be able to invest in those areas. We've already created a fair amount of carbon footprint reduction by investing in technology, and so we don't have trucks waiting in a smokestack situation. We have 9,000 trucks that come to the Port of Houston every single day, and so that's another way to really help the carbon footprint, is to invest in technology, get people through faster and through the electrification.
And Mr. Robinhold, would federal grants or federal mandates speed that up or be an obstacle, or?
They would, Congressman Byer. Thank you for the question. This actually harkens back to Chris's conversation earlier about, in some situations, electrification makes a lot of sense. Operations around the harbor, at airports, the ground service equipment, for example, getting those things switched over. Many airports have done that or are doing that now. And, a grant process to help incentivize that sort of switch is great. That larger question around what about the vehicles that go further and fuel densification is an issue. I think that is a larger policy question where we would embrace a national policy instead of a state-by-state policy around carbon emissions, just for certainty for everyone involved. But you're absolutely right. Incentive programs or grants at a local basis for that ground site-specific equipment would be very helpful.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kildee?
First of all, thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, for holding this hearing. You and I have discussed this subject since I came to the committee, and this is a really important conversation, and I'm glad that we are pursuing it. I thank the witnesses for being here. One aspect of trade, and I guess you can kind of catch it in the conversation and the questions that come from members, is that our priorities are somewhat determined by the districts that we represent and the parts of the country that we represent. In my case, for example, in Michigan, our largest trading partner is Canada. We trade largely in agriculture products and in auto, and so a lot of our focus is on that. That being said, despite the fact that Canada is our largest partner, Michigan manufacturers and growers make products and grow products that we could export all over the world. Export markets like China, Brazil, Germany are potentially huge markets for us, but there are some challenges we have to overcome. And it's interesting, I'd like to get some comment on this. When we think about infrastructure in the context of trade, I think very often the conversation naturally leads to very trade-specific infrastructure. Ports, airports, ports of entry and departure. But it's fairly obvious, especially to those of us who live in the middle of the country, and particularly in older industrial places, that we're only as strong as our weakest link when it comes to trade. I mean, this is really about commerce and trade and productivity. And I wonder, maybe starting with Mr. Reagan, if you might comment on the necessity for us to think about this question of infrastructure and its impact on our ability to be competitive in this global economy, not being limited just to trade-specific, conventionally trade-specific infrastructure, but the entire network of infrastructure needs that both affect our connectivity to the rest of the country and the productivity of those parts of the country that have really obsolete aging infrastructure and haven't, even in periods of economic expansion, been able to fully participate in that economic growth. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think mobility helps drive economic growth. And whether it's getting transit systems that are able to get people to and from job opportunities, improving our road systems to make commuting more efficient, investing in our rail systems allow people to transport, go from one city to another rather easily. That helps drive economic growth. That means that people are able to get to new jobs, to boost their productivity, to contribute to the economy in a way that is going to create growth for everybody. And that is necessary. And we can't look at it strictly through port investment, although that's important. We can't look at it only through road investment, although that's important. All of these together are what's going to help grow our economy and make us better able to compete overseas.
I mean, Ms. Brown, one of the things that obviously you represent a diverse set of workers, but the legacy of your organization is one that we've obviously both witnessed and shared, that many pockets of this country are left behind, as I mentioned in my comment, even in periods of economic expansion. Can you talk about how infrastructure investment properly managed could lead to economic growth and job creation in some of those left behind places?
I really appreciate that question, Congressman Kildee. You know, so much of what we talk about in the Steelworkers is revitalizing the domestic manufacturing industry because we have experienced so much loss. We are so intimately familiar with trade and trade agreements and unfair trade because we've seen over 60,000 factories across the country close, doors shutter. And, there are so many opportunities to revitalize the sector, and a lot of that is really based in simple things, very low-hanging fruit things, like investing in infrastructure. You've heard all of us here at this table say that we would all agree that this needs to be done. The environmental community is not sitting at this table, but they would agree it needs to be done. Congressman Pascrell asked me the question earlier, then why isn't it happening? I would actually turn that question back to you guys. Because if all of us are saying we want to do it, and there are other parties who are not at this table are saying we need to do it, then we need to do it. And our members and other workers and people who want to work across the country within the manufacturing space would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. We have a guest with us, a committee member, not on the subcommittee, but you would be welcome, Mr. Ring, if you
Thank you,
wish
Mr.
to
Chairman.
inquire.
Thank you for holding the hearing. Thanks for letting me be your guest, and I appreciate the insights, input, expertise, and the time of our panelists. I'm going to try to get to the point and my perspective as a representative of a rural swath of America where we are at the epicenter of ag and energy production in West Texas. But regions like West Texas, rural communities are out there, hardworking farmers and ranchers and energy producers, making sure that the lights stay on and food is on the table, and blessing our nation with energy independence and food security. It's pretty awesome, and I'm so honored and proud to be a small part of that as the son of a tractor salesman and to be their voice here in our nation's capital. Now, Mr. Campbell, I know you are very familiar with the ports to plains relationship. We're upstream producing, and then we have a lot of midstream guys there in Houston, around the country, helping us transport the product to the Port of Houston. I was recently in Houston and got a good presentation on the challenges and opportunities with respect to our largest port in the nation in terms of volume. It was astonishing, the product that's moving in and out of that port. So it does affect the glut and the supply on our end, and it affects our economy. So we need that efficient, seamless movement of product there to that port and other terminals throughout the country. But with respect to Houston, the conversation was deepening the channel and widening it. And I was surprised to learn that there's no two-way traffic and that they have to really carefully navigate in and out of the port, these ships. It seems that there's a real issue of safety there, but there seems to also be a tremendous opportunity to expand the output that would just, again, contribute to the overall economy, not just of Texas, but of the nation. Can you just give me a quick perspective on the implications of us being able to do that widening and deepening of the channel there?
Certainly, Congressman. So today we're exporting around 4 million barrels a day, and Houston's the largest exporter of crude. In 4 years, it's likely to double. And so when you think about rural infrastructure, I think we all at this panel agree it has to be multimodal. Cargo and products flow like water. They find the least path of resistance. If you put a path of resistance in front of that product, whether it's agricultural in the Midwest or wherever, it's going to impede its ability to get to market, and they're going to buy the product somewhere else rather than from those folks. So ultimately, when you think about deepening and widening the channel, today we have a 52-mile channel from the ocean to the turning basin, and most of it is 530 feet wide and 45 feet deep. The challenge we have from a safety perspective is all of the safety challenges or accidents we've had that are very environmentally disruptive and what have you happen in that 530-foot part of the channel. So we're trying to expand it to 700 feet, which would allow larger ships to come in and create a whole lot more throughput for energy exports and for imports that are coming in as well. So it's really a project that would in fact help rural West Texas.
Thank you, Commissioner. The largest inland port is Laredo, Texas. Henry Cuellar, great guy, dear friend. And with the USMCA and with the economy growing and booming and expanding. We need to also make sure that we get this important product up through the heartland from basically Laredo through Canada. We have a lot of congestion around the population centers, Dallas, Houston, et cetera, et cetera. Mr. Spear, can you speak to the importance of making sure that in not so populated areas we can divert traffic, but also move this very important product, ag and energy specifically, around the country?
Yeah, it's absolutely imperative.
And after you answer, I'll yield back to the chairman. Thank him very much.
It's absolutely imperative. I began with my opening remarks on Laredo as an example. You've got 7,000 truck crossings each day. That's one way. So double that, because what comes in goes out. But moving that efficiently is absolutely imperative. We've only got 88 truck lanes with our border with Mexico, total, 88 total. And Laredo's moving 7,000 trucks a day. Yeah, that just puts it in context. So you've got great trade policy. You did a great job. We applaud you for passing USMCA. Wonderful. Not one of you would compromise security policy. That's not a partisan issue. But you've also got to have good infrastructure policy. And if you do all three simultaneously, then you're really cooking with something. Great. Whether you're urban or rural, you're all going to gain. And it's going to be more jobs. It's going to be more growth. It's really putting U.S. in a position to lead, not follow. And that's exactly what you need to do with infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. You haven't heard, but as several of my colleagues left, they were extraordinarily complimentary of what you brought to our hearing. The insights, the examples, it makes a big difference. The question, why, when there's this huge consensus, when the stakes are so high, and it's the least controversial issue before us, do we appear to still be stuck? Well, I think you're helping us unpack some of the ways to break the logjam. In part, we've had over 2/3 of the states in the last decade who've figured it out and have put together bipartisan initiatives to deal with revenues. I think that working with you, and I would hope that you would reflect on a couple of the questions that we've raised, because I like the notion that there are sources of revenue that could be dedicated to solve this problem that don't turn on the issue of fuel tax and the trust fund. That's a longer conversation. I do think ultimately we will be able to move that. But in the short term, being able to make progress. I appreciate your comments about the passenger facility charges, which would turn over resources to local communities to be able to make progress on things you're concerned with. The notion that there's customs and border money that's being left on the table. I mentioned the notion of having a trust fund that dealt with the movement of freight, a small levy that would be dedicated to this. I would request that you reflect with us on those or other things that are related to it, but look forward to being able to work with you so that we don't have to wait another year or two, that we can seize the moment, give you the resources you want, and your testimony here today is an important part, I think, in moving us forward, and I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.
Sir.